Hello, welcome back. It's time to finish up these notes. The last time we were discussing the notes, we were on the larynx. Remember, the larynx is the voice box, sits up on top of the trachea, and produces sounds, right? There's vocal cords in there. So then as we go down lower, we're leaving the upper respiratory tract and entering the lower respiratory tract, specifically everything south of the larynx is the lower respiratory tract, and it begins with the trachea. There's a lot of cartilage in the trachea. There's several C-shaped rings that um, continue downward. These are called the cricoid cartilage, which is actually hyaline cartilage. There's mucus inside here. There's ciliated cells too on the inside. Ciliated cells have little hairs on them. So when dust and debris that's in the air go down into your trachea, the idea is they get stuck in the mucus, and then the ciliated cells brush them back up where they came from. So if you're a smoker and you're smoking all the time, the tar and the other chemicals that are in there, one of the damaging effects that it has is it damages the ciliated epithelium. So, besides damaging your lungs, in addition to that. All right, so we have the nasal cavity back here. That leads to the pharynx, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, and then, of course, we have this glottis right here. Which is the opening to the trachea. So now we're in the trachea. And this is where the rings begin. Posterior to the trachea, we have the esophagus. That's where the food needs to go. And remember, this flap here, this epiglottis, diverts the food away from the trachea, sends it back into the tube where it needs to go. All right, so from the trachea, as we continue downward, we go into two different tubes here. On the left side, we have the left bronchus, and then on the right side, we have the right bronchus. You can see the cricoid cartilage continues even inside the lungs into the primary bronchi, right? The left bronchus and the right bronchus. And they're going to divide into bronchioles. Again and again and again, primary bronchioles, secondary bronchioles, tertiary bronchioles, and then eventually terminal bronchioles, where the air is going to end. It's going to reach a dead end, and it's in these dead ends that we find the alveoli. And these are like little sacs, these little grape-like sacs that is the site of gas exchange. All right. So these sacs are very, very thin. You have many, many of them. In fact, these are the structures of. The unit of structure and function, right? The units of structure and function in the lungs are called the alveoli. So this is where all the magic is happening. Basically, what does that mean? All right. So it's around these alveoli, these units, that we have capillaries on the outside, because remember, we have to send blood to the lungs so we can pick up oxygen. It's happening at these structures, these basic units. All right. It's inside the alveoli that we have a chemical called surfactant. Surfactant is like a detergent-like chemical that prevents the walls, the inside walls of the alveoli, from clinging to each other. All right. And again, this is the site of gas exchanges. So oxygen and carbon dioxide are being exchanged between the lungs and the blood. Oxygen is going from the lungs into the blood. Carbon dioxide is leaving the blood, exiting out the body through the lungs. All right. So if we were to remove all the lung tissue, we would get a good look at this trachea as it extends into the lungs, right? And then dividing into from primary bronchi to secondary bronchi to bronchioles. Now, if we look, the bronchioles do not have that cricoid cartilage protection that's keeping them opened up. We lose the cartilage as we go deeper and deeper in the lungs. But if we go take a really close look at the very ends, at the terminal bronchioles, we see these grape-like clusters, these alveolar sacs. All right, so we find the basic units of structure and function in the lungs or the sites of gas exchange. The two lungs, the left and the right lung, are separated by tissue in between them called the mediastinum. The heart would be sitting on top of the mediastinum. In fact, one of the lungs, the left lung, has a little notch where the heart would sit. It's called the cardiac notch. The lungs actually extend up past your clavicle. The apex of your lungs goes actually past your clavicle, your collarbone goes above it, and the lower part goes down all the way to the right above the diaphragm. The right lung and the left lung are different structurally. The right lung has 3 lobes or sections to it, where the left lung only has 2. All right, and that's because the heart kind of favors that left side, so it takes room away. So this is the left lung over here, and you can see the left lung has that notch taken out. The left lung also only has 2 lobes. You see this dividing line separating the lung into these lobes, where the right lung has 3 lobes, and it does not have that notch. So the heart would sit in here. All right. Everything between here is the mediastinum. This area right here is the mediastinum, we call that. Here's the diaphragm. Right lung, left lung. Remember that the lungs are sitting in a cavity, right? This cavity has walls, and these walls have serous membranes that line them. Specifically, the cavity where the lungs are sitting, which is called the pleural cavity, which is part of the thoracic cavity, is lined. These walls are lined with parietal pleura, right, which is a serous membrane. The lungs are also lined with a membrane, a serous membrane. It's called the visceral membrane. Remember, visceral membranes surround organs. Parietal membranes line the walls of cavity, but they're both serous membranes, so they both produce lubricating fluids. And there's a space between the two, right? There's a space between the lung and the cavity, right, wall. And this is called the pleural cavity, and this pleural cavity is usually filled with liquids, with lubricating fluids. And that's so the lungs, as they fill with air and expand, they don't rub up against the wall and erode. That lubricating fluid keeps them moving nicely in there. Okay, the diaphragm is that big sheet of muscle. Not only does the diaphragm create a barrier that separates the thoracic cavity, this chest cavity, from the abdominal cavity, but it's also a huge muscle that controls your breathing. All right, so when you contract your diaphragm, the diaphragm goes down, and at the same time you would be inhaling, right? And when you relax the diaphragm comes back up. And that's what you do when you exhale. All right. And we have a phrenic nerve that stimulates the diaphragm to contract. The diaphragm is connected to the brain through the phrenic nerve. All right. So the interpleural space is the mediastinum. And this is, like, again, as the picture just showed us, this is the space between the 2 lungs. And it's in this space that we have the viscera, those serous membranes, right? If we get into breathing a little bit, breathing is pulmonary ventilation, right? So this is what needs to happen in order to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the body. Really, it's Boyle's law that helps to control breathing. Boyle's law states that as volume increases, air pressure decreases. And as volume decreases, air pressure increases. So what does that mean? That means when we take a breath in, what's happening is our rib cage is expanding, the diaphragm's going down. It's creating more space in our chest cavity. The chest cavity gets bigger, so volume is increasing. At the same time, because volume is increasing, the air pressure inside our chest cavity decreases, and that's what forces air from the outside in to fill that new space. All right. So Boyle's law also dictates that as we relax the diaphragm goes up, the rib cage goes in, the amount of space in your chest cavity gets smaller, right? So the volume is going to decrease. That's going to cause an increase in pressure, of air pressure in the chest cavity. And that's what's going to force the air out of the body back into the environment, right? It's kind of like having a balloon in your hand. If you squeeze the balloon, you're going to decrease the volume of the balloon. It's going to increase the pressure inside of the balloon, and the air is going to want to be forced out of the balloon. So this kind of describes the mechanics of breathing. Let's click on this video. I'm not even sure if this video is going to work, but let's see.